China, to live 60 years based upon their famine, based upon the harshness of the land, because many times they didn't have arable land in which in order to grow food, that to reach the age of 60 was an honorable position to be in, and you became an elder in the community when that happened. So in January, I will reach my 60th year, so I'm coming through this part of the journey. And the reason I mention that is because China was a place that I came and was introduced to Islam, in which I understand today. So first of all, let's go all the way back to the very beginning. And I was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan, the Motown Sound. And growing up there in the middle 50s, my parents are both college educated, and for that time period, not a complete rarity, but both of them were college educated. And at the time, my father had been previously married. I have a half-sister, and then I have 6 brothers, and the youngest of the family is a sister. And through that process of growing up, it was also, my parents were civil rights movement people as well. So in my very early age, literally in 1959 and 1960, I started my civil rights activity. Dr. King was coming to Detroit to speak, and they wanted to have a children's march. So my parents asked us, are you interested in doing that? I said, yes, I want to be part of it. And so that's when I really got involved in the civil rights movement at the age of 5. And it appears that their activism and advocacy rubbed off on me in a very big way. So that was the very beginning part. And then throughout the 60s, getting involved in student activities, both in school and outside, participating in things. And of course, being very young, I could not participate in those other big jobs like the students who were going on bus rides and things of this nature. Well, I just wasn't big enough for that. But definitely following through and understanding it. As I grew into the latter part of the 1960s, because of the civil rights movement, there was a major increase in terms of women's rights and also gay rights. Those things also came out of the civil rights movement, that people were claiming their rights all across the board. They wanted to change in the status quo. And so with that movement, things were happening. Now, I have to say that as a young child, my mother told me, my mother was a school teacher, and my mother told me that at the age of 3 I was reading and writing. And because of having older siblings, and this is something they find in research, that when children have older siblings, they tend to get ready for school earlier. So at 3 I was actually talking and writing, and literally writing coherent pieces at that age and articulate. And even to the point to where my mother had to sit me down when I was 4, and she says, okay, now you have to realize something. You don't get into adults' conversations, particularly when you're telling them that they're wrong. And I'm like, well, am I wrong? She says, yes, you're right, but you don't do that. So I had to learn some social rules and social clues at that time. So, but I was always an activist, and so that's been part of the process. In the late 1960s, as I went to high school at 12, and as I was finishing up high school at 15, I was going to turn 16 in that following January, so I graduated in December. And we had a ritual in the household. My father required that we finish high school. We didn't say you had to go to college, but most of us did go to college. I had one brother go to trade school, and he became a carpenter, but the rest of us did go to college and complete college. And so at that time, when you received your diploma, there was a ritual where you turned it over to my father, and he granted you that you were now your own adult, and that you can then choose what you wanted to do in your life, and that they would be there to support you. For example, how supportive he was, when we were born, he bought a house and used the house as rental income so that he could build the funds to send us to school. So this is the type of thing they really stressed education. And so that was kind of the process. When you became your own person, then he would tell you, okay, now when you're going to school, and if you stay at home, he would pay for a while. If you go away, he would help. And so I decided I was going to go away. But he did help significantly through the process. But one thing happened in my senior year of high school, and that was, there was a radio program that came on, and it was called W4, it was a station. And they used to have like the morning show where you have the commuter drive. And so they had two fellows on there. So they had this one routine that was called the morning show. And they did this one skit. They showed this fellow was trying to talk to his father about him and his lover. And so every time he would talk to his father, he said, well, yeah, you know, Jim, and I already know where it friends and everything. He said, yeah, it's always good to have good friends, blah, blah, blah. And he says, yeah, but we're closer than that. You know, I said, well, it's always good that you and your business partner are real good friends. And every time he would try to explain to his father that he had a gay relationship, the father would ignore it, avoiding the obvious. And this went on for a couple of minutes in the routine, so it was quite hilarious because every time he would get closer and closer without saying the word that he was gay, the father would then turn it off to something else. Well, I think this is what happens to people when they don't understand sexual orientation. And so those are one of the things that, at that time, understanding the Stonewall started in 1969, that this was going to be a process in which people were going to have to learn to become educated about the variances. As much as people were learning about the education of being African American or Latino or a person of color in America, they would also have to learn about sexual orientation and those diversities as well. So, with that, after graduation, I went off to college. I went to Michigan State University for a year, and I found that though I did very well in school, I carried a 3.4, 3.5 average in school. I was not mature enough to deal with those young people who were there, who were smoking, drinking, sexing, all of those things. I'm still reading comic books. So I talked to my parents, and I told them, well, I want to come back home and go to school from home. And they said, sure, come back. So I went back home and started studying then. But it allowed me to get a full-time job as well. And so I started working for several large corporations due to affirmative action. And while in high school, I'd taken typing and shorthand because I knew I was going to have to write my papers and take notes in class. So that gave me entree into upper management in these large organizations. So I was assistant to the VP of Michigan Bell Telephone Company, for example. So this is where I got up, and they provided me particular management training. So I wound up getting a lot of education that involved me in terms of running large corporations and things like that, and then wound up with the American Arbitration Association and things like that, and which eventually got me into the law. Now, I did that for several years, and then in 1975, I decided I was going to move to San Francisco. But I said, well, that was a gay mecca, and it was a place for me to go to. Being in Detroit, it was a very closed-minded situation there. People just were not very open-minded. So I moved to San Francisco in 1975 and lived there for several years until 1979. There I met one of my great mentors. His name was Montford Cardwell, who was now deceased. He died in 2002. He had an aneurysm and died, but he was the first African-American to head the San Francisco Art Museum of Art. And so he had been studied in New York City, New York City University, and came out there. Well, it was wonderful. He was a great sculptor. I mean, fantastic. Some of his work was just unbelievable. To give you an idea of what his work was like, he took 8x8 oak, and it was head to death, and he did this for blind people, for them to understand what a track meet was. So he had a hurdler that he carved out of this piece of wood. I mean, I saw it when he started, and when he finished it. And it was so visual, because for blind people to touch it, you could touch the faces of the audience, you could get the vision of that, but also the man who was the hurdler, the black man, that the hurdle was extended out, so it was 3D, and you could touch, you could feel the muscles, the nostrils, the eyes, everything. So it was quite a beautiful piece of work. So this gentleman, in such detail, he was very helpful in educating me to understand that though you may be gay, there's also a quality of life that you must maintain as a person. And that it's not just about sex, but it's about who you are as a person, and being gay was just one of those adjectives added on to many other tools and skills that you had. So I was very thankful for his education and development. And in a lot of ways, it kept me out of the milieu in terms of that, because I got into a relationship very early in that time. This was before I was Muslim. And then the process in growing up there. Then in 1979, there was the first gay and lesbian march in Washington, which I participated in. I was actually one of the San Francisco referees who went there. And so I helped in the particular march and development of that. And when I was there, it was quite interesting that at the march, and I'll go back to some other things that I'll talk about a little bit later, but there at the march, I was one of the members of the audience looking to the stage. But 30 years later, I was on the stage looking out at the audience. which shows that sometimes when you're in the process of things, you move from one level to another, to another, to another. So that was very powerful and part of the journey along the way. Now, let's back up now about almost